Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and today we're going to talk a little bit about, not about my book, The 7 Laws of Abundant Living, but you can go to our website, ignitinganation.com, and read about the Tree of Life, both in the Garden of Eden and right there alongside the River of Life. Scroll to the bottom of the page, put in your email address, and you'll get the first chapter for free. Today we are going to talk with Rabbi Steve Letter, author of the new book, More Beautiful Than Before, How Suffering Transforms Us. Rabbi Letter is a senior rabbi of Wilshire Boulevard Temple in Los Angeles and the author of such critically acclaimed books as The Extraordinary Nature of Ordinary Things and More Money Than God, Living a Rich Life Without Losing Your Soul. He studied at Northwestern University, Trinity College, Oxford, and Hebrew Union College. He's a recipient of the American Jewish Press Association's Louis Rappaport Award for Excellence in Commentary and the Religious Action Center's Kovler Award. He is a fellow in the British American Project, a think tank bringing together leaders from America and Great Britain. Newsweek named him as one of the 10 most influential rabbis in America. He lives with his family in Los Angeles, California. Rabbi Letter, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Thank you so much. Very honored to be here with you.
You know, as two Jewish boys that grew up learning about our life, our family's life. My father was from Hungary, my grandparents from Galicia. This assimilation, my grandparents moved into the Solomon Schechter kind of thinking and the conservative movement, but I was raised at Road of Shalom under rabbis that you know, Rabbi Solomon Freehoff, Walter Jacob, men of great stature, great study, who always reminded us that in every situation we face, we always take a little bit out of the cup to remember the suffering that our people have gone through throughout our history. Even our birth as a nation went through a great deal of suffering. Now, you had this same kind of training as a young Jewish boy. You grew up in what part of the country?
I grew up in Minnesota, in the Midwest.
In Minnesota, okay?
Yeah.
Jewish community in Minnesota.
Correct.
When did you feel the calling to go into the rabbinate?
Well, you know, I would say that there were 2 or 3 pivotal moments. I knew very early, very early. First of all, I grew up, although I grew up in Minnesota, where you wouldn't think there were a lot of Jews, and there weren't. Most of them lived in one single neighborhood in this suburb of Minneapolis called St. Louis Park, which was affectionately referred to by us as St. Jewish Park.
Right.
And, you know, there was a Jewish enclave of about, I'd say about 10,000, people all clustered together. And I walked to school, for example, in the morning with 100 Jewish kids from my street. So I was raised, in a sense, in a microcosm that was the Jewish world itself. Then I was the kid who loved being up there for his bar mitzvah. Loved it. Just loved every minute of it. And I felt very comfortable up there, and I felt at home on the pulpit. And then when I was 14, I got into a little bit of trouble. I was playing drums in a rock and roll band. I was the 4th of 5 kids, so my parents were kind of done parenting by the time I showed up. And I got into a little bit of trouble. I got arrested for shoplifting some Bob Dylan albums at Target. At least I had good taste.
Yes.
And my parents went to see the rabbi because they were so distraught. And the rabbi said, he's a good kid. He's just bored. You have to change his peer group. You should send him to this Jewish camp in Wisconsin. And that summer, my parents sent me to a Jewish camp in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. From the moment I stepped off the bus to the moment I left in tears to go home, I was in love with every moment of it. I loved it all. First of all, it's the first time that I'd ever seen such a joyful Jewish experience.
Yes.
The music, the activities, the counselors, the way we slept in these big army tents like a kibbutz and grew our own food in the garden. It was the 70s. We wrote our own prayers and our own prayer services. And I saw for the first time in my life rabbis who were also, now this is a 15-year-old thinking, of course, normal people. I saw rabbis in T-shirts and shorts who could throw a baseball. This was a revelation to me, because my rabbis back home, like yours in Pittsburgh, were very, stern, intellectual, Germanic men in suits and ties, and they were relatively unapproachable. And here, this is where I woke up and saw, my goodness, you can be a regular person, a normal person, and take Judaism into your life in this way and live it in this way. And so I would say, honestly, from that experience at 15 years old, I never really looked back. I knew that this was for me, and I set myself on that path and have been on it ever since.
So you refer to your bar mitzvah now. I was born in 52. There was no such thing as bar mitzvah in the Reform synagogue, so
Right.
I had to go to Bnei Israel, sitting under Rabbi Rab, to get my bar mitzvah when all my friends were going to, they weren't having bar
Right.
mitzvahs, or they were they were either Orthodox or conservative. But my father, coming from a Hungarian background, changed the name, said, nope, we've had enough persecution.
Right.
We're not going to talk about the old country. There's two kinds of Jewish families that came out of the Holocaust. Those who never talk about the Holocaust, and those who only talk
Yes.
about the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And I was one of those families that there was never a discussion, and my father acquiesced to allow me. And so I came to him at 13. I remember this vividly, because we would take Hebrew Union students into our home, which was the tradition. You went there.
Yeah.
During the high holidays, you would be distributed out among various communities and stay in people's homes.
Right.
Part of advancing, it was
For the curriculum. Yeah.
but it was almost evangelical in its own way, that it introduced a young, like myself. I was very impressionable. I wanted to be just like them.
Right.
They
right.
became my role models, and
Got it.
are you going to come back next year and build a relationship? And I went to my father and I said I wanted to be a rabbi, and he said, what kind of job is that for a Jewish boy?
Mine said pretty much the same. My father, when I told him, it was my junior year of college, I went to Northwestern University and studied writing, but I only studied writing because I knew it would help me in the rabbinate. So I had no intention of being a full-time writer. And I remember my junior year, my father sat me down to talk about my future life plans. And he said, Stephen, the way I see it, you have a couple of options when you finish college. One, you could go to law school and then take over Leader Brothers, which was the junkyard that my father owned with my uncle. So A, you can go to college,
All right.
finish college, go to law school, take over Leader Brothers. Or B, you could not go to law school and take over Leader Brothers. Those were my two choices.
Right.
And then I told my dad, I really think I'm going to go to Hebrew Union College and become a rabbi. And his first reaction was very negative. And he said to me, rabbis are beggars. You're going to spend the rest of your life begging for money. And he really was opposed to it. It wasn't until many years later, when he saw me preach in my first pulpit, which has been my only pulpit, and I looked out there and saw this wide smile, and I knew that he understood.
Rabbi Leader, you make such a good point. For those of us who have had strong experiences in certain parts of our familiar world, biblically there's only Jews and Gentiles. There's only two people of the Bible. Either you're Jewish or you're
something else.
Or you're something else.
Right.
But the many trips that I've made to Israel, could you turn your volume down just a little bit? We're getting some feedback. The many trips I've made to Israel, reminded me of the days when we had the posters on the up and down the streets of Pittsburgh, "Save Soviet Jewry." You remember that?
Yes, of course. Yes.
You're right. So it takes us back to an earlier day.
It was the
when
70s.
that was the late '60s, early '70s, exactly. And you had a pushki. You had a every child brought home a canister, tzedakah box, and you were putting quarters, nickels, dimes, trying to fill it up and save it and bring it into your shul or your temple, whatever it was that you went to then have this money sent. Now, I understood it because we brought one of my relatives from a displaced persons camp, who was from Austria, who lost all the members of her family. But people don't really relate to, they look at the Tanakh, they look at the Old Testament, and they say, okay, these are people that were disobedient, they were rebellious, they were stiff-necked, but you and I would look at it as suffering, and this goes to the very theme of your book. Suffering is what changes us. Suffering is what causes us, the calluses that we form on our hands if we do repetitive work, makes that hand stronger.
Well, look, and the opposite is also true. This is my experience, but I think it's almost universally true that, look at the other side of that. What does success really teach us? Nothing. The only thing success teaches us is to keep doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. It's really only failure, disruption, pain that forces us, and I'm not using the word causes us, I'm saying forces us to change. So in that sense, pain, frankly, is the greatest and only teacher. And by the way, let's be careful here, at least from my perspective in my book, More Beautiful Than Before, How Suffering Transforms Us. I do not idealize pain. I mean, let's not idealize or glorify pain. Right. Pain is pain. It's terrible, and it hurts, and it's frightening, and it's isolating, and it can bring us to our knees. I'm not saying that the lessons we learn from pain are worth it, but neither are they worth less. That's the point, right? Let's not over-idealize pain. But the fact of the matter is that all of us, each of us, in our own way, has to walk through some kind of hell in our lives. The point is that we don't have to come out of that hell empty-handed. Don't come out of hell empty-handed.
So to really rephrase and summarize to make this clear, don't go out to suffer so you can become more beautiful. Life will hand you all of its own suffering that you don't have to go out and seek. If the message is more beautiful than before, how suffering transforms us, don't go out and seek out some suffering because you want to be more beautiful. God has a plan, and in that plan, He's going to take us. And I wish I remember which venerable rabbi taught me this lesson. Yeah. But he said, you take a piece of wood, and in its raw form, it's got bumps on it when you first carve the plank. He said, and then the sandpaper hits it, and the wood cries out in the pain of the high spot, and it immediately pulls away because it hurt. But the longer the contact, the closer you get, the less the high spots, until finally, after a while, even the friction begins to fade. And when we finally pull away, we see a piece of polished, beautiful ebony. And we see that the sandpaper that was once so harsh has become a polishing cloth.
Yes. And
And
look, I wish there was another way. I wish something else could smooth those rough edges and reveal that inner beauty. But I haven't found it, and certainly in my life, it's been the most painful and challenging things that have ultimately created the blessings of my life. You know, there's a chapter in the book called "The Root," Route, of all blessings. And I ask in that chapter for people to take a blessing inventory of their lives. What are your greatest blessings? And then to think back to where those blessings actually began. In what are they rooted? And this is the Rooted, right? So
right.
the root, Route, of all blessings are rooted, Rooted, almost always in some form of adversity, some form of pain that stimulated this growth that resulted in these blessings. Ask most people what it is they have sacrificed the most for in their lives, and then ask them what means the most to them in their lives, and they'll be the very same thing.
That's so true. Now, your story is kind of interesting because you did very intentionally take your own personal suffering. You describe a most painful situation, and I could actually see you crawling out of the car in your
Yeah.
in your garage at home, um, being as stiff-necked as
Oh,
listen,
yes.
listen. We earned 14 million of us, maybe another hidden 14 million. We don't know. We're beginning to find in Africa many little pockets, and India many little pockets of Jewish communities that have been hidden away for years. We don't really know, but 14 million being the number, we're a very, very small population of people, and it's because we've been unbreakable. No matter what atrocity over 5,000 years has been passed our way, and what's come out of it, and it's interesting because on Friday I did a special on community. The
Hmm.
Jewish community has maintained its identity because we were charged to be a people. The English word hallowed in Hebrew translates to set apart. We were called to be a people set apart. So, how do you do that? You build a community and you identify with that community, you weigh into that community, you don't separate yourself from that community, you have that identity. And every time we go into a new city, the first thing we do is we find some way to build a community center, a hospital, a home for
That's
the aged. It's what we do to plant down roots, because if we can plant in the ground, you can't move us. And you ran us out of Europe, you ran us out of the former Soviet Union, not you, but the larger you of history. Uh, but we've suffered. But we don't suffer in despair. Uh,
well. To be frank, I think despair is a part of it, but we don't remain
yes.
in despair, right? The book is divided into three sections: surviving, healing, and growing. You know, when you're in that initial moment of extraordinary pain and shock, the first set of essays in the book are about how to survive that, because you how do you just remain vertical through all of that? The next phase is healing. How do you find your spiritual core? How do you find your truest, deepest strengths and beliefs? And how do you reach out to the people around you in ways that help you heal? And then finally, the growing. How are you going to change your life and make your life, in a sense, more beautiful as a result of the suffering you have endured? That the Talmud says, if you are visited by pain, examine your life,
Ra- Ra-
change your life.
Rabbi, one of your chapters is on prayer, and I want to use this as an opportunity. We have a worldwide audience in the millions that range from right now being watched in Saudi Arabia, watched in Israel, all the way through the nations. There's a perception that Judaism is either Chabad, Lubavitch, born out of Nikolaev, we're sad, we're heavy laden, and we're not a joyful people that enjoy a rich prayer life, and they don't understand that our liturgy is worship, it is prayer, it's designed to be that way. That prayer and faith, last 16 years I've taken groups to Israel. I always take Christian groups to Israel so that they can see that we really are people of the book, that we really do still, even in Tel Aviv, in the most secular parts of Tel Aviv, on Shabbat, they all still gather at the beach. They may not gather in the shul, but they gather at the beach. They still honor Shabbat in their own way. It is not something that has turned us into a quote-unquote pagan group of people that have rejected God. Prayer plays a part in our life. It may play a different part in our life, and the way we render prayer looks different than it does on Sunday morning. Our Saturday morning versus someone else's Sunday morning may look entirely different, but it's the same God. It is the same words. The psalmists, there's not a place that I've ever been that has not quoted King David in some way or another, in some reference point at some point in time.
I agree. There's more that unites us than separates us as Jews, for sure.
Very much so. And so you talked about in this time that you were going through the suffering portion. That you turned to prayer.
Yes.
What did that do for you? What purpose did that play?
Right. Well, in my view, the most terrible aspect of pain is the terrible feeling of abandonment that accompanies it. The feeling of being in it alone. And anything that can pierce that sense of aloneness, of rejection, of alienation, begins the process of healing. And of course, if you're a believer, which you and I are, you're never alone. You can pour your heart out to God. You can weep with God. You can laugh at yourself with God. For me, I have always found prayer easiest in nature. Before my back injury and spinal surgery and all the opioids and the depression and everything that came with it, which I talk about in the book, I used to pray aggressively, and you've seen people I know who pray this way. It's sort of a race toward God. And after my injury, I found myself praying in a far less aggressive way. I almost, to put it this way, I almost allowed the prayer to come to me rather than me chasing after the prayer. I sat in stillness and in quiet and allowed the prayer and the words of the prayer book to come to me in a new way, in a gentler way, frankly, in a more meaningful and beautiful way. But talking to God was the initial piercing of my isolation. Now, of course, since we're all created in that divine image, reaching out to my friends and family and allowing them in was also a part, in a way, of that prayer experience. You know that certain prayers can only be said in a gathering of 10 or more people. So to pray as a Jew definitionally requires community, requires that you reach out, requires that others reach out to you when they know you're immobile, when they know you can't get to the synagogue, you can't get to your neighbor down the street. So the very act of being part of a prayer community brought me together with others and others together with me at a time when, frankly, I could just as easily have pulled the blanket up over my head and remained in darkness. So prayer for me was this initial kind of light in that darkness. And I, to this day, pray differently than I did before, less aggressively, more openly. And there's a prayer that we call in Hebrew Asher Yatzar, this prayer that thanks God for the finely tuned bodies that we have, our arteries and veins. And in this prayer, it says that, if we were to have something wrong with our body that was severe enough, we would not be able to stand before the King of Kings for a single hour. It's a prayer of gratitude for our bodies. I say that prayer. I keep it in my closet upstairs. And I say it every morning when I get dressed. Because every morning since my spinal surgery and the recovery, I'm grateful that I can bend over and put on my own socks, which I was not able to do for months. And so I pray now with a far deeper sense of gratitude for what seems to be ordinary things. But of course, there is no such thing as a small blessing.
Right. For our audience that's not familiar with the term minyan, or what Rabbi is referring to, a group of 10, we go back to the story of Abraham pleading on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah. And as he's negotiating numerically, if there were but 50, if there were but 20, if there were but 10 righteous men, would you save this group? It established that this was a point at which God said it was almost like the minimum number that would validate the righteousness of a community. And that is carried forward for over 4,000 years to this day, that 10 men will gather. Now, I believe that they're allowing some women now to join in to become a minyan. So there's a modernization, there's a new season.
That's right.
It's truly a dynamically changing season from what you and I grew up in.
It is. But it also, this concept of the minyan, of a minimum of 10, a community of 10 in order to pray, really speaks to how important it is to reach out when you have a spiritual need. Let me quote the Talmud again. In the Talmud, there's a chapter in my book that's called "The Prisoner Cannot Free Himself." I think that's such a profound notion. The prisoner cannot free himself. We need to reach out to others when we feel somehow locked in, somehow stuck, somehow imprisoned.
Right. Rabbi, it does my heart good, because we have worked so hard to break down some very stereotypical things about Israel, about the Genesis 15 promise of the land versus the Moses delivering the message of the conditions of enjoyment of the land, being two very, very different things. And that the right to Eretz Israel, to the land of the defined borders, which today is Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, northern Saudi Arabia, northern Egypt, are really defined by God as belonging in this covenant relationship with Abraham as an everlasting covenant. But people say, but you did this, you did that. Yes, when we look at the Exodus, when we look at the Mosaic message that God has passed, saying that your enjoyment of the land is conditional upon your obedience, but your title to the land, it's almost like I own a house, but I can't live in it because I didn't take care of it. Other people had to come in and keep it up for me, but the title never changed out of my name. But they live there, or they live in a part of the house.
It's kind of like your parents saying, this will always be your home, but if you can't behave, you're going to have to live somewhere else.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. So as you made this journey through this, how long had you been a rabbi?
How long have I been a rabbi?
No, right. At this point in time, the Exodus.
Actually, it's a more important question than you might realize. It's the reason I wrote the book. When I had this terrible car accident and the resulting back issues and spinal surgery, and as I said before, a lot of problems with opioids and depression following until I finally came out of it all, I had been a rabbi for 27 years already, and I had counseled thousands of people through very painful situations, and frankly thought I was doing a pretty good job. But then pain struck in my own life in a very, very searing and paralyzing, literally, way. And I realized after I'd spent about a year and a half coming out of that experience that despite my best intentions and efforts the previous 27 years to help people through pain, I knew nothing about pain. With this new insight, I felt it important to share what I thought I knew about pain versus what I knew now, and to use this book as a way to counsel people who were too far away from me to ever make it into my office to sit upon what I call my couch of tears. And so the book, in a sense, is my ministry to those I cannot physically reach.
This is the heart. You know, when I tell people about the IDF, and I tell them that the charge of the IDF is that your job is to preserve life. We charge our army to become defenders and to attack or to take the life of a prisoner. But the IDF is charged with the preservation of life. We're a people whose commitment to community, to God, is the preservation and the restoration of life, is to raise the level. And
as you know, in Jewish law, that saving a life supersedes all but 3 commandments. So, you know, you can violate virtually every commandment if it will enable you to save a life, except for 3, of course.
Yes, which of course is why on Shabbat you can save a life on Shabbat.
You violate any rule of the Sabbath in order to save a life. The only 3 rules you're not allowed to violate to save a life are you're not allowed to commit murder to save a life. In other words, to privilege one. You're allowed to kill in self-defense.
Yes.
Remember that the 10 commandments say thou shalt not murder. They do not say thou shalt not kill. But you're not allowed to murder to save a life. You're not allowed to commit public apostasy, and you're not allowed to commit a host of violent sexual crimes in order to save a life. Barring those 3 circumstances, anything can be done to save a life. You're right. The IDF, Judaism, the nation of Israel, we privilege life above all else.
So deep in your heart, your loss, your suffering, excuse me, almost obligated you from a, you know, I don't want to, I try not to, I spent 44 years under the Talmudic teachings of Hillel, and so many that I want to make sure that I go back to the Tanakh when I try to draw, but we must, for the preservation of God's command to replenish the earth, to be fruitful, to give back, to return even something which we have lost, which we have found, is to share that experience, because that edifies God, that glorifies God.
To put it in Jewish mystical terms, this book that I wrote, you know, it's interesting because the title actually fits with what I'm about to say. The title, again, is more beautiful than before, How Suffering Transforms Us, is my tikkun. Yes. Now, you know that tikkun is a Hebrew word that means repair.
Yes.
And there's this view of the mystics, of the Jewish mystics who lived in Sfat near the Sea of Galilee, that every human being is born with a unique particular tikkun, a unique particular repair that he or she, and only he or she, is capable of bringing to the world. And I think you're right that my suffering my ability as a writer, as a preacher, as a father, as a husband, as a son, as a man, all of it came together in this book to make this book my tikkun, the repair I can offer from my soul to those who suffer in the world.
So every one of us is charged to become a Band-Aid to a particular wound in the
That's
world.
right. To find our tikkun, our particular repair. And I with all my heart believe that this is it for me.
Which is a revelation of biblical proportion, to have the clarity that out of suffering would come new life.
Listen, out of suffering comes the call.
Yes,
Right?
that's so well said.
And what is the right thing to say when one hears the call? What Abraham and Moses said, Hineni, here I am.
Hineni. There it is.
Here I am.
I want to take for a moment and step out of you into your wife's role as caregiver.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at surviving, we know it was not an independent action. You did not save yourself. It was the hands and it was the feet, but and you became intimate with the opioid challenges, with the opioid. Am I in pain or am I not in pain? I think I'm in pain, so I must need medication. There's a whole dynamic to that, which gave you an intimate understanding in a world that doesn't understand that in the caregiving world. I'm not talking about you going out on Sepulveda and buying drugs. We're talking about you in pain management and your wife as a caregiver to the man that she loves. How did that change your view of your wife in your marriage?
Well, there's another chapter in the book that is called An Intimate Invitation.
Yes.
Pain is an intimate invitation. It is an invitation to become intimate. And I don't mean that in a sexual way, of course. To become spiritually and emotionally and physically intimate with the people we love and the people who love us. You know, to love a person when he or she is whole is one thing. To love a person when he or she is broken, badly broken, is quite another. That is a far deeper and frankly more beautiful and powerful expression of love. And that's the kind of love that I received from my wife and from my children when I was so badly broken. And I will forever be grateful for for experiencing in my vulnerability the power of my wife's love.
As you went through the surviving, through the healing, and now into the growing part, you're now on this side of the experience. Now you're looking over not Lot's wife as a violation of the looking back, but
Yes.
in the blessed way of God asking us to examine, as we do each year in this period of examination of the days of awe, this time that God has always set aside for our people, a period of time of self-examination, self-reflection, and self-reconciliation, first with ourself in our vertical relationship, for if that does not exist, we cannot repair any of our horizontal relationship.
I agree.
So you've now come on this side of it, and your relationship with God has increased because you've needed and you've cherished the fellowship that in the pain and in the alone moments that you were reminded that he was right there with you. Now you come to this point of growing and you start out with a chapter examining your life.
Yes. Yes. Well, as I said earlier, one of the most powerful phrases in the Talmud is when the rabbis say, if you are visited by pain, examine your life. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you've done something to deserve the pain. We all know that innocent people suffer. What it does say is, whether you deserve it or not, it is an opportunity to change your life. I've used this opportunity to change my life, to deepen, for example, the level of conversations I have now with the members of my congregation and with people all over the world, to try to knit together a community of sufferers. The veterans community has discovered this book. The recovery community has discovered this book. The grief community has discovered this book. The love and loss community has discovered this book. The way in which this mission has changed my life is it really has deepened the conversations that I now have, even casual conversations. Secondly, it has helped me edit my life, in a sense. It has helped me get rid of the things that were not deep and are not important. It's helped me focus more on the pastoral side of my rabbinate and less on the running of the business of a mega synagogue, less on the fundraising, less on the memos and the meetings and the marketing and all of that nonsense. To remain focused on the real mission of caring for people's spirits. And finally, it's helped me treat myself with greater kindness and sensitivity. I have much greater respect for my body, much greater respect for the necessary limits that a 57-year-old workaholic who grew up with a terribly demanding father has to have in place in order to lead a spiritually balanced life. So the end result of this experience has really been a more beautiful life for me, and by beautiful, of course, we don't mean anything in the physical sense, because frankly, the scar on my back is not very beautiful. But beautiful in the sense that it has helped me get rid of and remove the things that were distractions in my life, and it has helped me treat myself with greater dignity and respect. And that's a very powerful blessing.
It's an inventory which is all-encompassing, that once you finish the examination, very much like going to a doctor, getting a full workup, a full checkup, you get a report. And as you share that report, your ears get more tuned in. I'm sure that your counseling practice has become more dynamically empathetic, more dynamically sympathetic, more dynamically compassionate, because you've experienced,
yes,
and what you did not experience, you examined.
Right, and also more authentic. My conversations now with people who are suffering have an authenticity that they never, ever had before. So, and again, you're right in the sense that the growing part requires an understanding of where you were that you never could have achieved without the pain. One of my favorite quotes is by the Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan, who said, "I don't know who discovered water, but it wasn't the fish." I just love that. I don't know who discovered water, but it wasn't the fish. The fish is born in water, lives in water, and dies in water, and ironically, therefore, isn't even aware it's in water. It has the least perspective on its own life. When does a fish discover water? when you catch it and pull it out of the water. That's when the fish discovers water. That's when it's gasping on the banks of the stream, flailing and gasping for breath, at the end, wriggling at the end of a hook. That's when the fish discovers water. That's pain. Pain jerks us out of our own complacent reality of which we were not even aware, and gives us perspective and appreciation and insight in a way that cannot be achieved otherwise. And that's the blessing of pain.
So in your message of you matter, the last really 3 chapters, you matter, fix something in the melody of what remains.
Yes.
We've got about 6 or 7 minutes, and I don't want to, what I'd really like to do is have you take those moments and deliver a message to our audience of what it was that was birthed from this. Why are you personally, and now have the ability to make the world more beautiful than before, this transformation that comes from suffering?
I appreciate that opportunity. I want to begin with a quote in the book from Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky said that his greatest fear was that his life would not be worthy of his suffering. That his life would not be worthy of his suffering. In other words, we all suffer. We all experience pain and isolation and rejection and abandonment. We all hurt. There are many forms of the hell we walk through. The hell of cancer, the hell of divorce, the hell of a kid in trouble, the hell of betraying, by the way. Something else the book talks about, which very few books address. What do we do when we are the cause of suffering? What do we do when we've hurt another badly and deeply? What do you do when you are the betrayer, not the betrayed? It's its own world of pain and suffering. So we all walk through some form of hell. We don't get to choose that. To be human is to suffer. The only thing we get to choose is whether or not we ennoble that suffering with the way in which we live the rest of our lives. Will our suffering make us more compassionate, more sensitive, more present? Will we take our own lives and gifts more seriously, or will we continue to squander them on nonsense? Will the people we love now know in a deeper and more frequent and more powerful way how much we love them? Will we say it? Will we embrace and hold each other in a way that matters far more than it mattered before we had some perspective on the value of life and its many blessings because of our suffering? Make your life worthy of your suffering. Ennoble yourself. I can't think of anything more godlike, more Christ-like, more important than to be worthy of the suffering we endure. There's this beautiful final chapter in the book about the violinist Itzhak Perlman, who I think most people know contracted polio at a very young age and walks with leg braces and crutches and has his entire life. And this is a true story. He walked onto the stage one evening to play a concerto, and just before he was to begin, a string broke on his violin. And he proceeded to play the entire concerto by reworking the fingerings in his mind. He played the entire concerto from beginning to end without missing a beat. And when he finished, of course, the audience went absolutely crazy. Standing ovation for 15 minutes. And he finally quieted the audience. Everyone sat down. He looked out at them and he said, "It's my job to make music with what remains." We can all, in spite of, and frankly, because of our suffering, make beautiful music with what remains, and create for our lives that are kinder, gentler, and more beautiful than before. That's being worthy of our suffering. That is ennobling our lives because of our suffering. Lead a life that is kinder, gentler, and more beautiful than before. Be a blessing.
Rabbi, you've touched my heart. You've touched our audience heart. The words "Kol Emet," the voice of truth, total and absolute, without exception. Kol being the all-encompassing all of alls. God has a way of making us strong at the broken places. He does that not for our own benefit and our own blessing, which it does become because you are now able to live on this side of it, but it's when you share it. And it's no different than the Shamash candle on the Hanukkah that says that when I take that light and I share that light, I don't diminish my own light by doing so. I brighten the world without having to diminish my own. And the story that you've woven together, More Beautiful Than Before, How Suffering Transforms Us, shows us exactly that message. That through your suffering and through your pain, you could then share the light that you received and share it with others so that they too can have a way to make it through to the other side of the suffering. And that's really the message of deliverance. It is the message of healing. It's a message of reconciliation with pain. It is learning to honor this temple which God has given us, that He's implanted our souls, our spirits, our hearts, and the mind that He's given us, the Sekel and the Chachma. I'm not even going to explain that, but you know what I'm speaking of, the thing that Solomon asked for and Solomon received. Rabbi Steve Leder, Senior Rabbi at Wilshire, it's Wilshire Boulevard Temple, and in Los Angeles, California. If you visit LA, do yourself a favor. Go listen to this man speak, but if you can't, or regardless, if you can, you can't, please get his book, More Beautiful Than Before, How Suffering Transforms Us. Rabbi Steve Leder, you are always welcome here.
Thank you.
With us, you are mishpacha, and thank you for your friendship, and thank you for being here on our program, Revealing the Truth.
Thank you. It was an honor to be with you today.
Thank you.
Truly.
We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.